The silence at Cold Creek Tower. Deep in the remote stretches of the Cascade Mountains, there are places where the tree canopy grows so thick that the forest floor never sees the sun. Above this dark ocean of pine and fir, suspended on wooden legs 70 feet in the air, sits the Cold Creek Fire Lookout. It is a fragile glass box in the sky built to watch over hundreds of miles of unbroken wilderness. For most of its history, it was a place of quiet solitude, a sanctuary for those who preferred the company of the wind over the noise of the world. But according to local forestry legends, the tower has stood completely abandoned since the late summer of 1974, left to rot in the damp mountain air because of what happened to the last man who lived inside it. His name, according to the old ranger logs, was Thomas. He was a veteran of the wilderness, a quiet man in his early 50s who had spent over a decade working solitary seasons in various watchtowers across the Pacific Northwest. The job of a fire lookout requires a specific type of mind. For 3 months at a time, there is no human contact, there are no visitors. There is only the sweeping view of the horizon, the shifting weather patterns, and the endless, crushing silence of the mountains. Thomas was used to this rhythm. He arrived at Cold Creek in early June, carrying a radio, a few books, and enough canned provisions to last until the first snow of November. For the first 2 months, his daily reports to the main ranger station in the valley were completely routine. He called in at 8 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening, reporting humidity levels, wind direction, and lightning strikes. His voice over the radio was always calm, steady, and professional. But as August approached, the atmosphere in the mountains began to change. A thick, unseasonable fog settled into the valleys, refusing to burn off during the day. The air grew heavy and unnaturally still. Birds stopped calling from the canopy below. It was during this period of oppressive weather that the radio operators at the base station noticed a subtle shift in Thomas and his transmissions. He began calling in outside of his scheduled times. At first, the calls were brief and pertained to minor details, a strange shadow he saw moving along the distant ridge, or a patch of dead trees he had not noticed before. But soon, the reports became less about the forest and more about the immediate area surrounding the base of his tower. On the evening of August 14th, at approximately 9:30 p.m., Thomas broke radio silence to ask if any hikers had registered for permits in the Cold Creek sector. The operator informed him that the sector was closed due to the fog and poor trail conditions. No one was out there. Thomas paused for a long time before replying that he had seen a flashlight beam moving slowly through the trees about 200 yards east of his position. The operator, assuming it was a lost hunter, told Thomas to keep his searchlight off and remain in the cabin until morning. Thomas agreed, but his voice sounded tense. He mentioned that the light did not look like a standard flashlight. It was too pale, and it did not bounce or sway like it was being carried by someone walking. It simply glided through the timber low to the ground before winking out in the thick mist. 3 days later, the situation escalated. It was just past midnight when the base station radio crackled to life. Thomas was speaking in a hushed, strained whisper as if he were afraid of being overheard. He reported that someone or something was standing at the edge of the tree line just beyond the reach of the moonlight. The radio operator asked if he could see a face or clothing. Thomas replied that it was too dark, but he could see a tall, misshapen silhouette. It had been standing absolutely motionless for over an hour, facing the tower. The operator suggested sending a patrol up the mountain at first light. Thomas agreed, but before he signed off, he muttered something that sent a chill through the dispatch room. He said the shape had not arrived by walking out of the woods. He said he had been watching the tree line, and the shadow had simply materialized from the fog as if it had seeped up from the damp earth itself. The patrol that hiked up the next morning found nothing. The ground around the tower was undisturbed. There were no boot prints in the mud, no broken branches, and no signs of a camp. The rangers spent 2 hours checking the perimeter before hiking back down, writing the incident off as a trick of the fog, and the severe isolation taking its toll on the lookout. They advised Thomas to take a few days off and come down to the valley, but he refused. He insisted that he was fine and that the tower was his responsibility. That decision would become the focal point of a legend that has haunted the Regional Forestry Service for decades. The final radio transmission from Cold Creek Tower occurred on the night of August 21st. It began at exactly 3:15 in the morning. The operator on duty was half asleep when the console burst into a loud, hissing static. Through the heavy interference, Thomas spoke. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was frantic, breathless, and stripped of all professionalism. He did not use his call sign. He simply said it was at the bottom of the stairs. The operator, now fully awake, asked him to repeat the message. Thomas ignored the request. The microphone on his end was keyed open, broadcasting the ambient sound of the glass cabin into the dispatch room. The operator could hear Thomas breathing heavily, the sound of the wind rattling the window panes, and then something else. According to the official transcripts and the memories of the operator, a rhythmic, heavy sound began to echo through the radio. It was the distinct noise of weight being placed on wooden planks. Footsteps. But they were wrong. They were far too slow and far too heavy for a human being. The Cold Creek Tower had exactly 60 wooden steps winding up its metal frame. The operator listened in frozen horror as the slow, agonizingly deliberate footsteps climbed higher and higher. A heavy thump, a long pause, another heavy thump, another pause. The old wood groaned in protest under a massive weight. Through the radio, Thomas began to pray softly. He did not ask for help, knowing the nearest station was hours away. He simply backed himself into the furthest corner of the cabin. The footsteps reached the landing just outside the heavy wooden trapdoor that led into the room. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and Thomas taking ragged breaths. Then a sharp, metallic screech tore through the static. It was the sound of the heavy iron latch on the trapdoor being slowly turned from the outside. A latch that could only be reached by someone standing on the final step. Thomas let out a single, sharp intake of air, and then the radio went completely dead. The connection was severed, leaving nothing but an empty hiss filling the dispatch room. The operator called out frantically for the next hour, but no response ever came from the dark mountains. By sunrise, a full search and rescue team was navigating the steep, treacherous trail up to Cold Creek. They arrived at the clearing just before noon. The tower stood exactly as it always had, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. But when the rangers climbed the 60 steps and pushed open the trapdoor, they found the glass cabin completely empty. Thomas was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, the windows were intact, the furniture was upright, and a cup of coffee was sitting cold on the desk. The radio was still switched on, the microphone resting on the floor, his boots, his jacket, and his emergency flare gun were all still hanging on their hooks. The only strange detail the search party noted was a foul, stagnant odor lingering in the cabin, smelling strongly of wet soil and ozone, and deep scratch marks etched into the thick wood of the trapdoor on the inside of the cabin. Despite weeks of searching the surrounding valleys and ravines with dogs and helicopters, not a single trace of Thomas was ever found. The Forestry Service officially classified it as a case of severe psychological break, suggesting he had wandered off into the woods in a state of delusion and succumbed to the elements. The tower was locked, boarded up, and eventually decommissioned. But the legend of Cold Creek did not end with the official report. Over the next 30 years, hikers and rogue campers who ventured too close to the abandoned structure began to return with deeply unsettling stories. Those who have camped in the shadow of the tall, rusting legs report waking up in the dead of night to a sudden, absolute drop in temperature. They speak of the forest going completely silent, the crickets and the wind simply stopping. And then, in the suffocating quiet, they hear it. The slow, heavy creak of the lowest wooden step bending under an immense, unseen weight. The sound of wet, heavy footsteps beginning a slow ascent toward the empty glass box in the sky. Few people ever stay long enough to hear if the footsteps reach the top, but those who do claim that when the sun finally rises, the old iron latch on the trapdoor is always found unhooked, swinging gently in the cold mountain air. Caught on accident. In late 2019, a deputy's dash camera in Mobile, Alabama, captured something nobody expected to see in ordinary traffic. The clip looked boring at first, yet a single frame turned into an evidence problem that wouldn't go away. By the time state records were requested, the moment had already been copied and shared in quiet circles. Jordan Klein was 32, a paramedic, and he only wanted a calm overnight shift at a Mobile County rescue station. He'd taken extra hours because his partner was out, and he needed money for a used truck. Near 1 a.m., dispatch logs show a call about a stalled van near the industrial waterfront. Jordan and his driver rolled out expecting dehydration, alcohol, or a simple mechanical breakdown. They turned toward the river yards where lights were sparse and most businesses were closed. Deputy Lena Hart was 29, a sheriff's deputy, and she was already near the same stretch of road. Her job that night was traffic patrol, and she was finishing a report when a vague call came over radio. The dispatcher said a van was stopped in a lane, and a caller sounded unsure about what he saw. Lena's dash camera switched to continuous recording as she pulled onto the frontage road. She wasn't looking for a mystery, she was looking for hazard lights and a quick tow request. The van sat half on the shoulder, and its rear doors were shut with a new padlock. A man stood beside it, and he waved like he had been waiting for someone specific. Lena noted his calm posture, then she parked behind the van and stepped out slowly. Her body camera audio reportedly captured the man saying he was just delivering cleanup supplies. He offered a laminated badge, yet the badge didn't match any local contractor listed in her car system. Jordan arrived moments later, and he saw Lena speaking with the man under a sodium light. Jordan introduced himself and asked if anyone needed medical help because the call mentioned possible injury. The man said no one was hurt, and he insisted the van was safe and could stay there briefly. Jordan's driver glanced at the padlock, and he noticed a faint chemical odor coming from the hinges. Nothing about it screamed emergency, yet everything about it felt slightly out of place. Lena asked for the van registration, and the man said the paperwork was in the glove box. He walked to the driver's door and opened it, then he leaned inside as if searching slowly. The dash camera caught his hands trembling, and the movement looked practiced rather than nervous. When he turned back, he held a folded sheet without a signature line, and he avoided eye contact. Lena asked his name again, and he gave one that sounded like it had been rehearsed. Jordan stayed quiet, but he watched Lena's flashlight pass over the rear door seam. There were fresh scrape marks around the lock, and a thin, wet line ran down the metal. Jordan didn't touch it, yet his training told him the liquid might be disinfectant or something harsher. Lena asked if she could inspect the cargo area for safety, and the man's tone changed immediately. He said it was bio waste, and he said opening it would violate a contract with a medical vendor. That word triggered a specific memory for Jordan, and it wasn't from a class or a news story. Years earlier, a supervisor had warned him about unlicensed waste hauling that sometimes appeared near clinics. Jordan had never seen it himself, yet some locals claimed it happened when disposal fees spiked. Lena called in the badge number and the man's name, and the reply came back as no match. She asked him to step aside, and he did, but his eyes kept flicking toward the rear doors. The next part is the reason the incident became famous inside a few offices, reportedly, and not in public. Lena's dash camera recorded Jordan walking to the back, then stopping when he heard a faint thump inside. It was soft, like shifting cargo. Yet it happened twice, and it didn't match the wind or passing trucks. Jordan looked at Lena, and Lena looked at the man, and nobody spoke for a full second. Then the man laughed once, too loud, and said the load settles during transport. Lena radioed for another unit, and her request was ordinary except for the tightness in her voice. The man said he had to leave, and he took one step toward the driver's seat. Lena moved with him and told him to keep his hands visible, and her camera angle shifted. That shift is where the accident happened, because the lens briefly caught the van's side panel up close. A torn shipping label showed a partial destination, and it looked like a facility code rather than an address. Jordan didn't know what he was seeing, but he recognized the color scheme from hospital packaging. The label showed specimen hold, and below it was a line that had been scraped away. Lena asked him again who he worked for, and he answered with a different company name. Records conflict on which name he used first, because the audio is muffled by traffic noise. Still, the inconsistency made Lena treat the van like evidence instead of a stalled vehicle. When the backup unit arrived, the man's behavior shifted from compliant to urgent. He said he would call his supervisor, and he started dialing while walking away from the van. The second deputy watched him, and Lena ordered Jordan to stand back behind the patrol car. Jordan followed that order, yet he kept staring at the rear doors and the padlock. He later told investigators the odor reminded him of strong sanitizer mixed with something metallic. According to archived notes from the Mobile County Sheriff's Office, Lena decided to request hazmat support. She did not open the van, and she did not cut the lock, because she lacked clear probable cause. Instead, she placed the man in temporary detention while she verified the cargo claim. The man protested loudly, and he repeated that this was protected medical material under federal rules. Lena answered that traffic safety allowed a basic inspection, and she asked him to identify the shipper. The man offered a phone number, and Lena called it on speaker, so the interaction was recorded. A woman answered, and she said she represented a contractor that handled routine disposals. When Lena asked for a license number, the woman paused. Then she said she would call back. That callback never came, at least not on any recorded line in dispatch logs that night. Within minutes, the woman's number went to voicemail, and the voicemail greeting sounded newly recorded. Hazmat units took time to arrive, and the delay created a window where choices mattered. The man asked to use the restroom, and officers refused. Then he asked for water. One deputy retrieved water, and the dash camera view briefly shifted again toward the rear doors. In that second angle, the camera caught a small vent hole near the top hinge. A thin piece of cloth was visible inside, and it did not look like packing material. Jordan noticed it too, and he leaned forward until Lena told him to stay back. Jordan raised his hands and said he thought there might be a person inside, not waste. The man yelled that Jordan was lying, and he said the cloth was a filter for odor control. Lena asked Jordan why he thought it was a person, and he said the earlier thumps sounded like movement. Investigators never confirmed exactly what Jordan heard because there was no clean audio of the thumps. The officers faced a problem that didn't fit their training manuals neatly. If it was bio-waste, opening it without hazmat gear risked contamination and a legal mess. If it was a person, waiting could mean injury or death, and that would be unforgivable. Lena called her supervisor, and her supervisor asked one question: "Do you smell anything like fuel?" Lena said no, but she said the chemical odor was strong and she couldn't identify it. They made a compromise decision, and it would later define every argument around this case. They didn't cut the lock, but they used a small camera scope through the vent opening. The scope footage was grainy, yet it showed stacked plastic totes and a narrow space behind them. For a moment, something pale moved in that space, and the officers froze at what they thought it meant. Then the view shifted, and the pale shape could have been a glove, or a label, or a human hand. The man saw their reaction, and he tried to bolt, but the second deputy grabbed his jacket. In the struggle, the man's pocket spilled receipts, and one receipt showed a purchase of heavy zip ties. That detail alone proved nothing, yet it changed how Lena described the situation over radio. She requested immediate forced entry, and she said there was possible unlawful confinement. Her supervisor approved, and the decision was recorded in the call log with a terse timestamp. When the lock was cut, the door swung open with resistance, like it had been sealed recently. A wave of cold air came out, and Jordan said the smell hit like a hospital supply room after a bleach spill. Inside were bins, absorbent pads, and what looked like sealed specimen containers in foam racks. Behind the bins was a teenage boy, alive, crouched and shaking, with tape residue on his wrists. He blinked at the light and whispered a name, but the first name was lost under overlapping radio chatter. Jordan moved in carefully, and he checked the boy's breathing while Lena kept her weapon lowered. The boy was around 16, skinny, and he wore a fast food uniform shirt under a hoodie. He said he worked late at a franchise in Mobile, and he accepted a ride from a man in a white van. He said he woke up inside the cargo area and he didn't know how long he had been there. His account changed on small details, and that inconsistency became a major issue in later reviews. Lena read the man his rights, and he kept repeating that the boy wasn't supposed to be there. He claimed the teenager broke into the van while it was parked, then got stuck when the doors locked. That theory did not match the tape residue, and it did not explain the sealed medical containers. Jordan photographed the boy's wrists with permission, and he later submitted the images to investigators. Those photos were mentioned in a county file from 2009 as a comparison point, oddly enough. That county file from 2009 was not about this teenager, and it was not about this man. It was an older complaint from a different part of Mobile County involving missing lab shipments and vague threats. The file described a small group using contractor vans to move materials without proper tracking. It also mentioned a teenage witness who recanted after his family received anonymous calls. Nobody could prove the cases were linked, yet these similarities made detectives reopen dusty paperwork. The medical containers in the van created a second layer of confusion because they looked legitimate. Some bore barcodes and facility codes, and one had a temperature strip that showed it stayed cold. Hazmat technicians cataloged everything, and they sealed the van as evidence. Later, a state lab reportedly confirmed that some containers held routine samples, while others contained unknown preservatives. Records conflict about whether any human tissue was recovered because some reports use vague language on purpose. The teenage boy was taken to a hospital, and Jordan stayed long enough to give a handoff report. He noted mild hypothermia signs, dehydration, and stress, and he recommended observation for chemical exposure. The boy told a nurse he remembered a smell like rubbing alcohol and plastic, and then he fell asleep. When detectives returned the next day, he asked for a lawyer before giving more detail. That choice fueled rumors, but investigators never confirmed whether anyone coached him or threatened him. Deputy Lena Hart expected the case to become a clean prosecution with obvious charges and clear evidence. Instead, the suspect's name didn't connect to any background, and his fingerprints returned no known criminal history. The van's registration led to a shell company, and the listed address belonged to an empty office suite. Phone records tied to the suspect were prepaid lines, and they went dark within 48 hours. Even the laminated badge appeared professionally printed, yet no matching employer could be found in state databases. Then the footage escaped, not through a leak from a deputy, but through a chain of routine requests. A public records clerk prepared a batch of video for an unrelated traffic case, and files were mixed. One clip included Lena's dash camera view of the torn label and the vent hole. The accidental inclusion was caught by a defense investigator who flagged it for his own reasons. Within days, copies existed outside the sheriff's office, and nobody could pull them back. Local reporters called it a kidnapping with medical trappings, but officials avoided that word publicly. A sheriff's statement said there was an active investigation involving hazardous materials and a juvenile. Behind the scenes, detectives pursued two theories that pulled the case in opposite directions. One theory said the boy was targeted, and the medical cargo was a disguise for transport. The other theory said the cargo was the main purpose, and the boy was an opportunistic addition. A month later, reportedly, the suspect was released on procedural grounds tied to evidence handling. The defense argued the forced entry lacked adequate cause, and a judge criticized gaps in documentation. Lena accepted the ruling without comment, but she requested internal guidance on future hazmat situations. Jordan heard about the release through coworkers, and he stopped taking overtime shifts near the waterfront. He said he didn't want to be the person who opened another door without knowing what was behind it. Years later, an investigator summarized the case in a brief memo stored with archived notes. The memo said the boy returned home, finished school, and declined every later interview request. It said several lab vendors were audited and minor violations were found, yet nothing proved a larger scheme. It also said the suspect moved out of state, though investigators never confirmed where he went. The memo ended with one line that felt like a warning: The discovery was incidental, not the operation. In Mobile, the road where it happened looks ordinary, and the waterfront lights still flicker on late shifts. Drivers pass the spot without noticing, and most nights there is no deputy parked in the dark. But in internal briefings, the incident is remembered for what made it so unsettlingly real. There wasn't a tip, it wasn't a sting, and it wasn't a planned rescue with clear villains. It was a camera that kept recording and a single accident that revealed how close a secret can sit to routine. Doctors couldn't explain it. The first call came in during a cold October shift in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and dispatch logs flagged it as medical unknown. A 34-year-old man had collapsed at a gas station near the Susquehanna River, awake but unable to speak. Witnesses reportedly told responders his eyes tracked movement, yet his arms stayed rigid at his sides. Marcus Lee, 29, an EMT, arrived expecting overdose or stroke and found neither pattern fit cleanly. The patient's breathing was steady, his pulse regular, and his skin showed no cyanosis or obvious trauma. By the time the ambulance rolled, 2 more callers reported similar symptoms across town within 20 minutes. Marcus noted the first patient's name as Ethan Weller, 34, forklift operator, who said he had been driving home from overtime. Ethan could nod slightly, but his jaw clenched hard enough to crack a tongue depressor during assessment. Marcus and his partner checked pupils and glucose, and both readings came back unremarkable for a collapse. Ethan's phone showed a missed call from his wife and a draft text that ended mid-word. The gas station clerk reportedly mentioned Ethan had asked for water, then stood frozen beside the cooler. When the rig pulled away, Ethan's legs began trembling in short bursts, like repeated shivers that did not spread. At UPMC Harrisburg, Dr. Aaron Caldwell, 38, emergency physician, met the ambulance at the bay with stroke protocol already running. Aaron's job was triage under pressure, and she focused on airway, then neurologic signs, then timeline from Marcus. Ethan could squeeze a hand on command, but only after long delay, and his grip strength varied each attempt. A CT scan showed no bleed, and a rapid panel ruled out several common intoxicants according to archived notes. Aaron ordered labs and fluids and asked for any exposures, medications, or recent infections. Yet answers stayed fragmented. Ethan's wife arrived and said he had been fine at breakfast, except for a metallic taste he blamed on coffee. Within an hour, 2 more patients entered the same department, both with unusual rigidity and intermittent tremors, and neither had fever. One was a 19-year-old college runner from nearby Mechanicsburg, brought in after collapsing during evening practice. The other was a 62-year-old retired mechanic from Dauphin who had driven himself in, then froze while signing forms. Aaron reviewed the vitals and saw stable oxygenation, stable blood pressure, and a pattern of delayed response that did not match seizure. Some locals claimed it looked like mass poisoning, but investigators never confirmed a single shared meal or event. State records later noted all 3 had reported drinking tap water that day, though many residents had without symptoms. Hospital staff drew blood cultures and sent toxin screens that took days, and none of the early results gave a clear target. Aaron spoke with a neurologist by phone, and they discussed catatonia, conversion disorder, and rare exposure syndromes without settling. The neurologist recommended EEG monitoring for Ethan, yet the machine showed no typical seizure activity during tremor bursts. Nurses documented that Ethan could hear and track conversation, and he blinked rapidly when asked about pain. Marcus stayed to finish his report, and he described a faint chemical smell near Ethan's clothes, like disinfectant or solvent. When Aaron requested the clothing be bagged, security logs recorded the items were stored, then later moved, and records conflict. By midnight, the county dispatch center received 4 more calls for sudden weakness and strange speech failure, all inside Dauphin County. Dispatch logs described callers using the same phrases: frozen, locked up, can't get words out, and breathing fine. One caller reportedly said her husband was staring at the television, crying silently and could not lift his hands. Another call came from a diner where a waitress dropped a tray, then stood still, eyes open, hands clenched. Responders transported 2 patients, while others refused transport and recovered enough to walk within an hour. The uneven course confused EMS crews because symptoms were dramatic, yet many cases resolved quickly with no intervention. County file from 2009 later showed a similar cluster noted as unexplained episodes, though the earlier event involved fewer patients. In the morning, Aaron reviewed Ethan's labs and saw mild electrolyte changes, not severe enough to account for paralysis, and no clear infection markers. A toxicologist requested additional testing for heavy metals and organophosphates, yet early screening was negative or below actionable thresholds. Ethan's rigidity eased slightly, then returned in waves, and nurses wrote that he whispered one word, water, then stopped again. Aaron asked about work exposures, and Ethan's wife said he handled pallets near industrial cleaners, but he wore gloves and reported no spill. She also said their neighborhood had complained about a strange taste in tap water the previous week, and the utility had denied issues. Some locals claimed they saw trucks by a pumping station at night, but investigators never confirmed that observation. A state epidemiology unit was contacted, and an investigator was assigned before noon. Nora Ramirez, 41, state epidemiologist, drove from Harrisburg's regional office with a cooler for samples and a checklist for cluster investigations. Her job required patterns, and she started with time, location, water sources, and any shared workplaces, then compared addresses by census tract. Nora requested hospital charts, and the hospital provided redacted records, with dates and times that later appeared inconsistent across versions. She interviewed Ethan, but he could only nod, and she documented that he reacted strongly when asked about a blue jug in his garage. Ethan's wife said they kept a 5-gallon container for filtered water, filled from a spigot at a public park. Nora collected the jug, and according to archived notes, it had an odor described as sweet, then sharp, then fading. She also collected tap samples from 3 homes, plus a sample from the park spigot, and sealed them with chain forms. Nora's preliminary map showed most early cases clustered along a corridor near Riverfront Park, yet 2 were miles away with no clear link. She contacted the Water Authority, and officials provided treatment logs that listed normal chlorine levels and normal turbidity readings. Records conflict on whether a pump maintenance event occurred that week because one document referenced flushing, while another stated no unusual operations. Nora requested fire department hazmat input, and a crew reported no gas leak alerts in the area during that window. Dispatch logs did show a small chemical spill at an industrial site upriver reported 2 days earlier, but the spill was described as contained. Some locals claimed the river smelled like bleach after the spill, yet investigators never confirmed odor reports with measurements. Nora flagged the case as active surveillance and asked hospitals to report any similar symptoms immediately. By day 3, Ethan's condition shifted in a way staff described as more frightening because it looked deliberate, yet he insisted it was not. He could write short phrases with shaky letters, and he wrote, "Can't stop it. Feels like my body isn't mine." Aaron documented that his strength testing was inconsistent, and she noted that inconsistent signs do not equal malingering. A psychiatrist evaluated Ethan and found no psychosis and no history suggesting catatonia, according to state records. Ethan's MRI showed no acute lesions, and his spinal fluid studies were reported as normal in one chart, then missing in another. Nurses recorded that a pulse oximeter alarm triggered during one episode, yet the recorded saturation never dropped below normal. Marcus visited once, off shift, and Ethan recognized him, then tremored hard enough to rattle the bed rails. Other patients followed different paths, and that made the cluster harder to explain with one diagnosis. The 19-year-old runner recovered fully within 12 hours and was discharged, yet later returned with headaches and blurred vision. The retired mechanic improved for a day, then developed slurred speech again, and his family reported mood swings and insomnia. 2 patients never went to the hospital and later told Nora they felt a crawling sensation under the skin, then sudden relief. Aaron reviewed those reports and noted that sensations are subjective, yet the clustering in time remained real. Hospital administrators worried about panic, and they asked staff not to speculate publicly, according to archive notes. A local radio host described it as a mystery illness, and that broadcast reportedly increased calls to dispatch for similar symptoms. Lab results began returning in fragments, and none delivered the clean answer that would close the file. A heavy metal panel showed slightly elevated manganese in one sample, yet not at levels typically linked to acute paralysis. Another report noted trace solvent compounds in the Park spigot sample, but the compound list was short and did not identify a single smoking gun. State records show the Park spigot was shut down temporarily, then reopened after flushing, though the exact date varies across documents. Nora requested comparison samples from other spigots, and those returned without the same trace pattern, or at least not recorded. The water authority stated the distribution system was closed, yet maintenance crews admitted a bypass valve had been used during repairs. Records conflict on whether that bypass could allow backflow from a non-potable line, because one engineer said yes and another said no. A separate thread emerged when Nora reviewed employment data and found 3 patients had worked at different times for a contractor that cleaned municipal facilities. The contractor had access to storage areas, including a room near the park restrooms where cleaning concentrates were kept. Nora interviewed the supervisor, who said all products were standard and stored securely, and there was no theft reported. Yet a county file from 2009 described an earlier incident where a mislabeled container led to diluted chemical used in a fountain line. That older report did not name a chemical, and it ended with no confirmed harm, but the detail caught Nora's attention. She asked for inventories and sign-out sheets, and the contractor provided them, though the sheets had gaps for several days. Some locals claimed teenagers had been seen tampering with the spigot, but investigators never confirmed any video evidence. Nora filed a request for park camera footage, and the response noted the camera had been offline for maintenance. Aaron tried to keep the hospital work separate from the investigation, but the cases kept returning in small waves. On day 6, a school nurse brought in a 30-year-old teacher from Camp Hill who complained of jaw clenching and sudden inability to speak. The teacher recovered speech after fluids and rest, and she left angry that no one could name what happened to her. Aaron's notes emphasized that negative tests are still data, and that clusters sometimes resolve before answers appear. She also noted that anxiety can spread symptoms in a community, yet that does not explain initial triggers and records conflict on which came first. Nora compared symptom onset times and saw a peak aligned with 2 afternoons, both near Hyde Park traffic. Weather data showed warm days and water use would likely rise, though no official record linked temperature to concentration. The best lead remained the park spigot, yet the chemistry results stayed too thin for certainty. Ethan remained hospitalized into the second week, and his story became the anchor because he never fully recovered on the same timeline. He improved enough to walk with assistance, then collapsed again after a shower, with rigidity returning almost instantly. A physical therapist documented that Ethan's gait was normal between episodes, then abruptly turned into stiff steps, with no gradual decline. Aaron asked Ethan if he had noticed triggers, and he wrote, "Tap water smell, like pool, then pennies." Nora arranged for a home inspection, and inspectors found nothing obvious, though a basement drain line showed signs of backflow after heavy rain. The home's water filter was labeled as changed in 2011, yet the date sticker was faded, and records conflict with the family's recollection. Ethan's wife said she had replaced cartridges in 2019, but she could not find receipts. Nora collected the used filter media and sent it for analysis, and results were reported as inconclusive. Public pressure grew, and officials tried to limit panic while still addressing uncertainty, according to state records. The Water Authority issued a statement that tests met standards, and they urged residents to run taps, then contact them with complaints. Some locals claimed their pets refused water bowls, yet veterinarians reported no unusual intake changes across clinics. A county commissioner asked the health department for updates, and meeting minutes show careful wording because no confirmed cause existed. Nora documented witness accounts, but she marked many as unverified, including reports of unusual trucks and chemical smells at night. Aaron's hospital received calls from reporters, and administrators directed them to the state office to avoid mixed messages. Meanwhile, dispatch logs recorded a drop in new symptom calls after the park's spigot closure, though correlation does not prove cause. Records conflict on the exact closure time, yet the decline pattern appeared in multiple logs. By week 3, most patients were stable, yet several described lingering effects that did not fit neatly into one category. The runner reported fatigue and brief tremor after workouts, and she withdrew from the season, according to archive notes. The retired mechanic developed anxiety about driving because he feared freezing at the wheel, and his family limited his errands. Ethan regained speech gradually, but he described it as pushing through thick resistance, and he avoided drinking from any source he had not bottled. Aaron referred him to neurology follow-up, and the neurologist documented functional overlay as a possibility, while emphasizing no definitive diagnosis. Nora closed active surveillance when no new cases appeared for 30 days, but she kept the file open, labeled Unresolved Cluster. A state record entry noted that environmental sampling did not identify a confirmed toxin at levels known to cause the symptoms described. Another entry mentioned that limited sampling and delayed collection could miss transient contamination, and investigators never confirmed duration. The final summary included the line records conflict, and it listed the park spigot as the most plausible shared exposure without confirmation. Months later, a county file update added a small detail that reopened quiet debate among staff who had been there. A maintenance worker reportedly admitted he had connected a flushing hose to the wrong line during an afternoon repair, then corrected it quickly. The worker's statement appeared in one memo, yet it was absent from another version of the same meeting notes, and investigators never confirmed it formally. Nora noted that a brief backflow event could introduce concentrated cleaning product into a low-use line, then dissipate before standard sampling. The theory fit parts of the timeline, yet it did not explain cases far from the park corridor and records conflict on their exact water sources. Aaron read the update and filed it because medicine rarely gets closure when exposures are short and documentation is imperfect. Ethan continued follow-up care, and he reportedly improved, though he said he still felt jaw tightness when he smelled chlorine. In Harrisburg, the calls stopped, but the lack of a clean answer stayed, like a file with the last page missing. Witnesses were there. On a cold Saturday in late November, the 911 center in Knoxville received 3 calls within the same minute. At 6:14 p.m., dispatch logs show a report of yelling near the Tennessee Riverwalk close to Volunteer Landing. Another caller said a man was on the ground, then he was not. A third caller insisted there were witnesses everywhere, yet nobody could describe the same moment. Responders drove in under steady rain, and their dash cameras caught only reflections and taillights. Mara Keene was 32, an emergency medical technician, and she was finishing a double shift at a private ambulance company. She stopped at the riverfront to meet her younger brother Caleb, who was 28 and studying civil engineering. Caleb had been photographing flood markers for a class project, trying to document how high the river rose in past winters. They planned to grab coffee downtown and head home before the weather got worse. A third person was already working the area, and state records list him as contracted security for event management. Lionel Briggs was 45, a former corrections officer, and he was assigned to patrol the promenade for vandalism complaints. Archive notes say he had been asked to check the bathrooms, the parking lot, and the stairwell by the marina. His radio traffic was calm until the 3 calls hit dispatch at once. When he keyed his mic again, he used a phrase that later showed up in a county file from 2009. The first ambulance arrived to a scene that looked ordinary, and Mara later told investigators it felt like missing frames. Two parked cars sat under the lamps, and the river moved fast beside the walkway. There were footprints in wet leaves, but no obvious struggle, and no person waving for help. Caleb pointed toward the stairs and said he had heard shouting, then silence, then running. Lionel signaled toward the marina gate and said multiple witnesses were right there, yet nobody stepped forward. Dispatch logs list the original callers as separate numbers, but their names were never placed in the public summary. Investigators later wrote that one caller claimed a man fell, while another claimed a man was dragged. A third described a woman screaming, even though officers found no woman matching that description nearby. Records conflict on whether the screaming was near the water or near the parking lot. Some locals claimed the shouting carried from the bridges, but wind and rain made direction hard to judge. Within 12 minutes, patrol officers formed a line along the walkway and scanned with flashlights pointed low. State records note that visibility was limited, and the river was high enough to swallow debris without leaving clear traces. Mara walked the edge with a responder's focus, looking for a shoe, a wallet, or blood in the puddles. Caleb tried to show an officer his photos because he had taken images minutes before the calls came in. The photos showed empty benches and an uneven pattern of wetness near the stairwell. Investigators never confirmed whether the wetness was from rain, runoff, or something else. Lionel's security report, later obtained through archived notes, included a short description of a fast-moving group. He wrote that 3 people moved past him heading toward the parking lot, and 1 person carried something dark. He also wrote that the group did not respond when he called out, and he assumed they were leaving before the storm worsened. Another witness contradicted this, reportedly telling an officer there was only 1 person running. A third witness claimed there were headlights that flashed twice, then a vehicle sped away. No single account matched all the others, and investigators never confirmed the group existed. Officers expanded the search to the upper road because tire tracks can show in wet grit near the curbs. They found tire impressions, but the area had constant traffic from restaurants and apartment garages. Dispatch logs show a request for traffic cameras at intersections leading toward Henley Street. A state records request later confirmed that several camera feeds were down due to weather and maintenance. That gap became central because the timeline relied on witness memory instead of video. Records conflict on whether the feeds failed before the calls or after the first units arrived. Mara and Caleb gave statements before midnight, and their details were consistent on one point. Both said Lionel seemed certain witnesses had seen something, yet nobody stayed to explain it. Mara reportedly described a man in a dark jacket near the railing, but she could not recall his face. Caleb said he heard a phrase, like someone repeating instructions, and he thought it sounded practiced. Investigators never confirmed that detail through audio because the area's microphones were not recording. Some locals claimed the riverfront had become a place for staged fights, but no state records supported that pattern. Early Sunday, a missing person report was filed by a family from West Knoxville, and the name entered the case file. The missing man was Aaron Stiles, 37, a traveling respiratory therapist in town for temporary hospital work. His employer confirmed he had clocked out and driven toward downtown around 5:40 p.m. He had texted a coworker about getting dinner, then his phone went silent shortly after 6:10 p.m. State records show his car was later found parked near a garage off Gay Street, locked and undisturbed. Investigators never confirmed he reached the riverfront on foot, yet multiple witnesses insisted they saw him there. The case turned on time, and the timeline was narrow enough to feel almost impossible. Dispatch logs show the 3 calls at 6:14, and officers arrived at 6:26. If Aaron had entered the river, currents could have carried him downstream quickly, but search teams found no clothing in the brush. If he had been taken into a vehicle, cameras should have caught movement near exits, but the outages removed that net. Investigators checked rideshare records, reportedly, but records conflict on whether Aaron had an active account. Some locals claim they saw a ride pickup, yet no driver could be matched to that claim. In the week that followed, detectives compared statements and marked points on a map of the walkway. Lionel placed the fast-moving group near the marina gate, while a caller placed the shouting closer to the stairwell. Another witness placed it near the fountain, which is farther inland and closer to the parking lot. Archived notes describe detectives walking the route with a stopwatch, timing how long it took to move between points. They concluded a person could not appear at all locations within the reported minutes unless parts of the story were wrong. Investigators never confirmed which part failed first, the perception or the memory. Caleb's photos gained attention because they were time-stamped within 7 minutes of the calls. One image showed the stairwell landing empty except for a discarded plastic bag stuck to a railing. Another showed a puddle with a circular ripple pattern, as if something had just dropped into it. Mara later said that detail bothered her because it suggested movement when the scene was described as empty. Investigators never confirmed what caused the ripple, and rain alone could explain it. Still, county file notes from 2009 describe a similar ripple detail in an unrelated incident near the same walkway. Records conflict on whether the earlier note referred to the riverfront or to a different park. Detectives interviewed Lionel again, and his second statement differed from the first in small ways. He changed the number of people in the group from 3 to 2, and he softened the certainty about the carried object. He reportedly explained that rain and glare made it difficult to judge shapes under the lamps. State records show he also admitted he had stepped inside a maintenance shed for several minutes to avoid lightning. That admission mattered because the calls came during that window. Investigators never confirmed where Lionel was exactly when the first shouting began. Some locals claimed security was often absent during storms, but no staffing logs were released to support that. Aaron's phone became another anchor point, and technicians tried to reconstruct its last known activity. State records note a final location estimate near downtown, but not precise enough to place him on the walkway. The phone did not make a call to 911, and it did not send a distress message. Detectives checked for any sudden power off, but the battery level could not be verified from carrier logs alone. Archived notes mention a brief ping near a tower on the south side, which conflicted with a north side witness claim. Investigators never confirmed whether that ping was Aaron's device or a misattributed connection. By early December, the rumor cycle was louder than the official updates. Some locals claimed they saw Aaron arguing with 2 men near the parking lot, and they said one man wore a reflective jacket. Others claimed a woman was crying, and they said she ran toward the bridge and vanished into fog. Records conflict on whether fog was present because weather reports list rain and wind, but not low visibility advisories. Detectives asked for door camera footage from nearby apartments, reportedly, but many cameras faced the street rather than the walkway. The few clips provided showed only blurred figures and passing headlights. Investigators never confirmed a usable image of Aaron after 5:40 p.m. that night. Mara kept working her shifts, but she stayed connected to the case because she was physically present when it began. She was careful with language, and she used the same neutral tone in every statement. She told a detective that the scene felt like a crowd without people, because of how many said they witnessed it. Caleb became more focused on the timeline, and he drew a diagram of paths between the stairwell and the marina gate. State records show detectives accepted his diagram into the file as a supplemental item. Investigators never confirmed whether his measurements matched the exact route taken by any suspect or witness. A search of the river continued for weeks, and divers entered when currents slowed. Dispatch logs show repeated coordination with fire rescue and wildlife officers, and they noted hazards from debris. No body was recovered in the initial month, and no clothing surfaced in brush lines downstream. That absence fueled a theory of abduction, but investigators never confirmed evidence of force. Another theory suggested Aaron slipped and the river carried him beyond search zones, yet records conflict on how quickly an object would surface. Archive notes mentioned that a similar drowning case in 2011 produced clothing within 48 hours. Investigators never confirmed whether river conditions were comparable because water levels and temperature differed. In mid-December, an anonymous tip came through a non-emergency line, and the transcript was summarized in state records. The caller claimed they were one of the original witnesses, and they said they saw Aaron pushed, not dragged. They also claimed a second man shouted that they saw it, as if directing the crowd's attention. The caller refused to give a name, and they hung up when asked to meet detectives. Investigators never confirmed the caller's identity, but they checked the phone number and found it was prepaid. Records conflict on whether the call originated near Knoxville or from a tower outside the county. Detectives returned to the riverfront and reenacted the timeline using patrol cars and marked distances. They tested how sound traveled across the walkway, and they found that shouting near the water could be misheard near the stairs. They also tested how a person might move unseen from the marina gate to the parking lot using shadows behind landscaping. Archive notes state that the lighting created pockets where faces disappeared, especially in rain. That supported the idea that many witnesses could be present, yet still fail to identify anyone. Investigators never confirmed whether those lighting conditions were the same on the night Aaron vanished, because several lamps were replaced later. By the time January arrived, the case file had grown, but it still lacked a single verified mechanism. Aaron's family pushed for public attention, and flyers appeared near downtown and along the Riverwalk. Lionel stopped working the contract, and his employer reportedly cited schedule changes rather than the investigation. Mara and Caleb avoided the riverfront, and they told friends the place felt normal and wrong at the same time. State records show detectives kept the case open as missing, endangered, not homicide, because no physical evidence supported death. Investigators never confirmed a suspect, and no arrest was made. Records conflict on whether detectives believed witnesses were mistaken or whether witnesses were accurate but withheld details. Years later, archived notes still return to that first minute, when 3 callers claimed they saw something clearly. Dispatch logs preserve the timestamps, but they cannot preserve what each caller actually saw with their own eyes. The river continues past Volunteer Landing, and storms still push glare across the lamps and pavement. In the county file from 2009, a margin note appears beside a different incident, and it uses the same phrase Lionel used. It reads like a warning, not a conclusion, and it does not name Aaron or Knoxville. Witnesses were there, and the record never resolves whether that fact made the truth clearer or harder to reach. Found miles away. In late October 2011, a routine solo hike near Bend, Oregon, turned into a case that never settled cleanly. Evan Mercer was 31, a wildlife biologist who logged field hours for the state and volunteered on weekends. He drove toward the Deschutes National Forest to check late-season elk sign before winter access closed. According to dispatch logs, his phone last pinged a cell sector south of town just after 3:10 p.m. State records show he told a coworker he would be back before dark, and he packed for a short loop. He parked near a signed trailhead used by hunters and mushroom pickers in a corridor locals treated as familiar. County file from 2009 lists prior rescues in the same drainage, mostly sprains and missed turns. Archived notes from the sheriff's office describe the terrain as open pine with sudden lava cuts and shallow ravines. Reportedly, Evan carried a day pack, a light jacket, and a GPS unit he used for work. Investigators never confirmed whether that GPS was switched on. At 9:40 p.m., his sister called non-emergency dispatch after repeated texts went unanswered. Dispatch logs record a deputy sent to the parking area, and the vehicle was found still warm enough to suggest recent use. The deputy noted a clean windshield, dry dust, and no sign of a struggle near the car. A state records request later showed the initial entry mistakenly listed the wrong trail name. Records conflict on whether the corrected entry happened that night or the next morning. Search teams assembled at first light with 2 K9 units and volunteers from a local SAR group. Reportedly, a dog tracked from the car toward the main trail, then swung off toward a basalt ridge. The handler wrote in archived notes that scent degraded quickly in shifting winds. Some locals claimed the area held game trails that pulled hikers downhill without noticing. Investigators never confirmed the exact route because multiple boot tracks overlapped after the first hour. Evan's gear list became a quiet argument between agencies based on family statements and field habits. His sister said he always carried a small headlamp and spare batteries, and she found an empty box at home. A coworker told investigators he sometimes left extras in his truck depending on the task. State records show the truck's interior was checked, yet the report did not list individual items. County File from 2009 used similar vague language, and that bothered some reviewers later. By noon, searchers reached the ridge where the dog had hesitated, and they found a footprint in soft pumice. It was consistent with Evan's boot size, though investigators never confirmed tread match to a specific brand. The track angled toward a seasonal creek bed that ran mostly dry, except for shaded pockets. Reportedly, a volunteer spotted a torn strip of survey tape tied to a branch, the kind Evan used at work. Records conflict on whether that tape was collected as evidence or left in place. The first night, temperatures dropped below freezing in higher pockets, with gusts that flattened the canopy's usual shelter. Dispatch logs show a request for additional thermal imaging, but the unit arrived late due to another call. A helicopter crew flew at dawn and reported no visual contact, just scattered deer and a few elk. Archived notes mention that the crew saw no orange clothing, which some found notable given hunting season. Evan had not been hunting, yet he knew the risks in that calendar window. On day 2, investigators widened the grid into a zone locals called the Backside, where trails thinned into old logging cuts. A retired forester told deputies that the cuts could look like roads from above, then vanish into brush. Reportedly, a second dog indicated near a fallen snag, then refused a rocky slot. The handler wrote that the dog seemed distracted, though the reason was not recorded. Some locals claimed feral dogs wandered there, but investigators never confirmed sightings that week. Family members arrived and set up near the command post, and the mood shifted from hopeful to procedural. Evan's mother gave a statement describing a mild concussion he had suffered in college with no lasting issues. State records show investigators asked about medications, alcohol use, and stress, but the answers were marked as negative. A coworker mentioned Evan had recently argued with a supervisor about funding, yet no threat was documented. The case file shows no indication of foul play at that stage, only uncertainty. On day 3, a volunteer found Evan's knit beanie near an unmarked spur, about 4 miles from the trailhead. Reportedly, it was clean and dry, despite wind and cold overnight. Dispatch logs note the item was photographed and bagged, though later inventory lists did not include it by name. Records conflict on the GPS unit, again, because a form referenced electronic equipment without detail. Investigators never confirmed whether the item was tested for fingerprints beyond routine handling. The beanie's location raised questions about direction, since it sat closer to a road than to deep backcountry. Yet that road was gated for the season, and tire marks were not reported in the area. A deputy wrote that the spur had light foot traffic from hunters, but no one admitted seeing Evan. Some locals claimed they heard a single shout the first night, though investigators never confirmed the time or the source. County File from 2009 includes similar reports, often later found unreliable. By day 4, the search focused on water features, even shallow ones, because of prior case patterns in the region. Crews checked culverts and creek bends, then moved to lava tubes that opened like dark mouths beneath brush. Archived notes from a state geologist warned that tubes could extend far under ridges, with multiple exits. Reportedly, a volunteer entered one opening with a rope team and found animal bones, nothing human. Investigators never confirmed whether all mapped tube entrances were searched, since some were undocumented. Meanwhile, Evan's phone became its own thread of confusion. because the last ping did not match a simple route. A records analyst later wrote that the sector covered a broad swath, including parts of Ben's southern edge. Dispatch logs show the family believed the ping meant he never reached the forest, but the parked vehicle argued otherwise. Investigators never confirmed whether the phone battery died or the device was powered off. Records conflict on whether a final outgoing text existed because carrier data was summarized, not quoted. On day 5, a hunter reported finding a small day pack on a slope near a lava cut. He said it was tucked under a branch, as if placed, not dropped. Reportedly, the pack contained a water bottle, a folded map, and a granola bar that appeared untouched. State records list no GPS inside, and the headlamp slot was empty. Investigators never confirmed whether the pack had been moved before deputies arrived because the hunter handled it briefly. The map in the pack had pencil marks that made sense to Evan's coworkers, though they could not date them. A field supervisor said Evan often circled habitat pockets and wrote short notes on the margins. County File from 2009 includes references to similar marked maps found after missing calls, though outcomes varied. Some locals claimed that lost hikers often tried to shortcut through lava cuts, then got turned around. Investigators never confirmed Evan's intent from the markings alone. 2 days later, weather moved in hard, bringing sleet and a wet snow that erased shallow prints. Dispatch logs show the sheriff's office reduced volunteer access, citing safety and low probability. A state SAR coordinator wrote that the search would shift to limited staff patrols focused on roads and known hazards. The family objected, and a private search group offered help, though funding was unclear. Records conflict on whether the private group coordinated through the sheriff or operated separately. For the next week, sightings came in from diners, gas stations, and a motel off Highway 97. Reportedly, a clerk said she saw a man resembling Evan buying coffee wearing a gray hoodie. Investigators never confirmed the sighting because the camera angle did not show a face clearly. Some locals claimed Evan's photo looked like many men in the region, especially in winter clothing. State records show each tip was logged, then closed as unverified. The case changed on the morning of November 6, 2011, when a county road crew radioed about a man on the shoulder. Dispatch logs record the call at 8:22 a.m., describing a disoriented person near Lapine, Oregon. The location was about 22 miles south of Evans Trailhead, along a corridor of forest and small communities. Reportedly, the man wore jeans, a t-shirt, and mismatched shoes, despite near freezing air. Investigators never confirmed how long he had been walking there before the call. The man was Evan, identified first by his driver's license, then by a deputy who had met the family. A medic noted mild hypothermia, dehydrated lips, and abrasions on his palms. State records show no major injuries, no fractures, and no signs of assault recorded at intake. Evan's hair was damp, though it had not rained heavily that morning. Records conflict on whether he had socks, because initial notes differ from later property inventory. When asked where he had been, Evan gave a fragmented account that shifted within minutes. He reportedly said he followed a service road that kept turning into trees. Then he stopped near water. In another statement, he said he slept in a ditch, then woke up farther away than expected. Investigators never confirmed the presence of a service road matching his description in that exact area. Archive notes mention that he asked repeatedly what day it was and seemed surprised by the answer. A deputy wrote that Evan's manner was flat and cooperative, with long pauses before simple answers. Medical staff noted he could state his name, address, and family contacts, yet he struggled with a timeline. Records conflict on whether he mentioned hearing voices because one early note used that phrase, then a later summary removed it. Investigators never confirmed any drug exposure, and a basic toxicology screen was reported as negative. Some locals claimed the hospital softened language to protect privacy, but that was never substantiated. The distance remained the hardest piece because the recovery point did not align with the search grids. To reach Lapine on foot, Evan would have crossed stretches of forest, private parcels, and at least one highway segment. Dispatch logs show no drivers reported a barefoot or ill-dressed man in the days prior. State records include a note that his jeans were clean at the knees, inconsistent with crawling or extended bushwhacking. Investigators never confirmed whether he had received a ride because he denied it and there were no witnesses. His missing boots created another conflict because the trailhead search began with a boot size assumption. Evan's family insisted he wore brown hiking boots that morning with a known tread pattern, yet he was found in light shoes that did not belong to him, according to his sister. Records conflict on whether those shoes were adult size 10 or size 11, and the chain of custody form was incomplete. Investigators never confirmed the origin, since no theft report matched the description in nearby towns. The daypack, beanie, and the recovery point created a scattered line that looked intentional to some observers. A search coordinator wrote that lost people sometimes abandon gear to move faster, though that usually increases risk. Evan reportedly said he left the pack because it felt heavy, even though it contained only water and food. Investigators never confirmed whether he understood what was inside, because he spoke as if the pack was full. Archive notes suggest his short-term recall was impaired, at least during early interviews. A week later, deputies conducted a follow-up interview with Evan at his family home in Bend. State records show he recalled stepping off the main trail to look at tracks, then noticing the light fading quicker than expected. He reportedly described a sudden silence, though he did not attribute it to anything specific. Investigators never confirmed weather anomalies, and official forecasts showed a normal drop in temperature. Some locals claim the forest goes quiet before snow, but that remains a common observation, not evidence. Evan's account of the first night was limited to physical sensations rather than events. He said he felt cold on one side, then warm, like he had been near a heat source. He reportedly remembered drinking from a puddle that tasted metallic, then feeling nauseated. Investigators never confirmed water quality at specific locations because he could not identify where it happened. County file from 2009 includes several notes about stomach illness in lost hikers, often tied to untreated water. Records conflict on whether Evan vomited, since medical notes differ. Searchers later revisited the lava cut where the daypack was found, looking for signs of a shelter spot. They reportedly found a shallow depression in needles and a few broken twigs, nothing definitive. A K-9 unit did not alert in that area during the follow-up, though conditions had changed. Investigators never confirmed whether Evan spent time there or whether the pack was placed by someone else later. State records show no fingerprints were recovered from the pack beyond what could be attributed to handlers. The evidentiary value was limited by time and touch. The case file includes a short section about possible head injury, based on abrasions and confusion. A medic wrote that Evan had a small bump at the back of his skull, consistent with a fall. Evan reportedly said he slipped on rock, then lost the next part without detail. Investigators never confirmed a specific fall site, and there was no blood found along the search trail. Some locals claimed a fall into a lava tube could explain the gap, but no tube entrance was tied to his route. Records conflict because the map marks could be old. Another section focused on exposure and decision-making, especially the clothing mismatch. Hospital staff noted his t-shirt was damp with sweat despite cold conditions, suggesting exertion. A deputy wrote that overheating can lead to poor choices, including removing layers too early. Investigators never confirmed whether Evan had his jacket at any point after leaving the trailhead. The jacket was not recovered in searches, and no matching item was reported at donation bins or dumpsters. County file from 2009 includes several cases where jackets were never found, and the file offers no explanation. The question of assistance remained open because Evan was found near a road corridor with occasional night traffic. Dispatch logs show no calls about a stranded hiker during the missing period, which some took as significant. Yet drivers may not notice someone in dark forest edges, especially in bad weather. Evan reportedly said he avoided the road at night because headlights scared him, though he could not explain why. Investigators never confirmed that claim through route reconstruction since he could not describe landmarks. Records conflict on whether he recognized Lapine when found because early notes say yes, later notes say no. A final complication came from Evan's work because he had access to radios and mapping tools. A coworker told investigators Evan understood the forest structure better than most hikers. Yet archived notes show even trained staff can get disoriented in lava terrain where ridges repeat without clear sightlines. Some locals claimed the area's false horizons mislead the eye when fog moves through. Investigators never confirmed fog that night from official stations, though microclimates can differ. State records show the agency did not treat this as a work incident since he was off duty. By December 2011, the sheriff's office closed the case as resolved, since Evan was found alive. The family pushed for answers about the boots, the scattered items, and the distance, but the file had few hard conclusions. Dispatch logs and state records remained consistent on the recovery date, yet conflicts persisted in the small details. Investigators never confirmed a crime, and they also never confirmed a clean, ordinary mistake that explained everything. In archived notes, one deputy wrote that the outcome was fortunate, but the path between start and end stayed unclear. Years later, when people requested the county file from 2009 and compared it to Evan's paperwork, they noticed repeated patterns of missing specifics. Items were listed without serial numbers, locations were described without coordinates, and interviews were summarized without direct quotes. Some locals claimed that gap was proof of a cover story, though investigators never confirmed any such allegation. The more likely explanation was administrative limits and shifting priorities during active calls. Even so, Evan's case remains cited in local talks because he was found miles away and the record still conflicts. This really occurred. On an overcast Tuesday in late October, a single 911 call from outside Asheville, North Carolina, triggered a chain of conflicting records. Megan Kerr was 29, a county GIS technician, and she drove into Pisgah National Forest to verify trailhead data for a new public map. She wasn't alone that morning because her older brother Luke Kerr, 33, worked as an auto mechanic and wanted a quiet day hiking nearby. According to dispatch logs, their plan was simple and time-stamped: arrive after sunrise and leave before dark on the same day. At 10:41 a.m., a short call reached Buncombe County Communications, and the caller said someone was screaming near a service road. Records conflict on what happened next, because two separate incident numbers appear in state records for the same hour and location. Megan and Luke parked in a public lot outside Brevard, then followed a marked path toward an overlook used by local visitors. Archived notes from a ranger interview say they carried one day pack, 2 water bottles, and a paper map folded into quarters. Luke later told investigators he stopped to adjust a bootlace, and Megan walked ahead for less than 90 seconds. When he caught up, she was not on the trail, and he assumed she had stepped off for a photo or a shortcut. He called her name several times, then tried his phone, and the call failed with no ring and no voicemail prompt. A county file from 2009 lists dead zones in that corridor, and Luke's statement referenced the same dead zone map. Luke reported that he heard a single sharp yell from downhill, then a second sound like gravel sliding on hard dirt. He moved toward the sound, but he later said the slope was steeper than it appeared and the leaves shifted underfoot. In his first interview, Luke said he reached a narrow wash and saw Megan's water bottle lying on its side, partially crushed. In a second interview recorded 2 days later, he said it was the day pack he found first and the water bottle came later. Investigators never confirmed which item was seen first, because the evidence log starts after the first search team arrived. Some locals claimed they heard shouting around lunchtime. Yet several hikers in the area reported nothing unusual at all. The first official response, per dispatch logs, came from a county deputy at 12:12 p.m. with a request for ranger assistance. A separate entry in state records shows a ranger call at 11:57 a.m. and it lists a different mile marker entirely. No one could explain the mismatch, and the supervisor noted that the computer-aided system was upgraded 2 months earlier. By mid-afternoon, 2 ranger units and a volunteer team began a grid search along the trail, the wash, and nearby service roads. They documented light rain, low cloud cover, and footprints that were hard to distinguish due to leaf litter and soft soil. A K9 handler's archived notes describe a brief scent interest near a culvert, then a quick loss of scent near running water. Another report says the dog never alerted at all, and the handler was not available later to clarify the wording. They found Megan's phone at 4:18 p.m., according to the evidence sheet, and it was face down with a cracked screen corner. The battery level was recorded as 12%, but the device powered off during collection and could not be reopened on scene. Luke was treated for scrapes and mild dehydration that evening, and he remained at the staging area answering questions. He told a deputy he never saw anyone else on the trail segment after Megan walked ahead, which matched 2 hikers' accounts. However, a third witness reported a dark pickup truck parked near a closed gate, and the county file lists that gate as rarely used. Investigators never confirmed the truck because no plate was obtained and the witness could not agree on the exact color. That night, search leaders suspended active operations due to fog and wet rocks, then resumed at first light with more volunteers. A thermal drone team scanned the tree line and the wash, and the report mentioned several heat signatures later identified as deer. One operator wrote that a faint rectangular reflection appeared near a bank, yet the follow-up sweep found only wet plastic litter. The reflection note remained in the case folder, but it was marked as unverified in the summary statement. Luke slept in his vehicle, and his phone records show several outgoing calls to Megan's number that never connected. On day 2, a ranger located a torn strip of gray fabric about 300 yards off trail, consistent with Megan's jacket description. The fabric was wet and snagged on rhododendron, and no blood was visible in photographs stored in the case archive. Field tests were not conducted at the scene because the supervisor said contamination risk was high during the ongoing search. Later lab notes reportedly list the sample as inconclusive for human material, and the report does not explain the test method. The same day, a volunteer found a set of keys in the wash, and they matched the spare set Luke carried for the vehicle. That discovery raised questions, because Luke initially said the keys never left his pocket, and he insisted the pocket was zipped. Some locals claimed someone could have taken them during the confusion, yet no one reported thefts at the staging area. A deputy wrote that Luke appeared stunned and cooperative, but the note avoided conclusions and did not assign motives. Searchers expanded outward into Transylvania County, and mutual aid was requested with the understanding that jurisdiction lines were unclear. A state records entry shows a brief handoff discussion, and the summary says the last confirmed location was still in Buncombe County. That statement contradicts a ranger map in the archive, which marks the phone location inside Transylvania County boundaries. Investigators never confirmed which boundary layer was used because the mapping system had multiple versions during that season. Megan's employer provided her recent work tickets, and one ticket mentioned verifying an old drainage line near a service road. The drainage line appears in a county file from 2009, and it sits near the wash where the phone was recovered. Some search leaders believed she might have followed that feature, thinking it was a quicker route to the overlook area. Others argued she had no reason to leave the marked trail, because her GIS task did not require ground truthing that far off path. The disagreement was documented in archived notes, and it remained unresolved in later briefings. On the third day, a ranger found a shallow impression in mud near a culvert shaped like a knee or forearm contact point. Photographs show a disturbed patch with leaves pressed into wet silt, but no scale marker appears in the first image set. A second image set includes a tape measure, yet the timestamp differs by nearly 6 hours from the first set. Records conflict on whether the impression was preserved before rain arrived, and the supervisor noted hurried conditions. No clear prints were lifted, and the case file lists the impression as possible sign of slide without further detail. Luke was asked to walk searchers through the trail again, and he complied while a deputy recorded his route on GPS. That GPS track later appeared in the file, but it does not match the times written on the interview transcript header. A clerk wrote that an export error could shift timestamps, and the note said the route still looked consistent spatially. Investigators never confirmed the export error explanation because the vendor support ticket was not included in the case archive. Luke's rewalk ended near the wash, where he paused and pointed to the area he said he heard the gravel sliding sound. Later, a volunteer team found a broken branch above that spot, but the report says it could have been caused by weather. On day 4, a tip came in from Hendersonville where a gas station cashier reportedly saw a woman matching Megan's description. The cashier said the woman looked wet and dazed, and she asked for directions to Brevard while holding a phone with a cracked screen. The time given was 5:20 p.m. on day 1, which would place her far from the search area during active operations. Dispatch logs show the tip was received at 9:03 a.m., but the call recording was later missing from the digital archive. Some locals claimed the woman was Megan, while investigators noted the description could fit several people in that region. The gas station had cameras, but state records say the footage was overwritten before a request was made due to short retention settings. That loss became a point of frustration in later reviews, though the official summary avoided editorial language entirely. Searchers also received a second tip about a dark pickup, this time from a resident near a gravel pull-off outside Rosman. The resident said a truck lingered near dusk, and someone appeared to move something heavy from the bed into the woods. The statement was logged, yet investigators never confirmed the exact date, because the witness later shifted between 2 days. A deputy drove the area and found no fresh tire tracks, and rain had fallen for hours before the follow-up check occurred. Archived notes show the tip was categorized as unverified vehicle sighting and then placed behind other leads in priority. Luke provided his financial records and agreed to a voluntary phone extraction, though the extraction report lists multiple errors. The report says the device used for extraction failed twice, then succeeded on a third attempt after a software update. Those errors matter, because Luke's phone location data on day 1 appears in 2 different formats across 2 reports. One shows him near the trailhead lot through early afternoon, and another shows brief movement toward a nearby highway at 2:07 p.m. Investigators never confirmed which dataset was correct, and the case file includes a note about carrier triangulation limits. No charges were filed, and the notes avoid claims about wrongdoing, focusing instead on the inconsistencies in digital records. Weeks later, a state agency review compared the dispatch logs with ranger narratives, and it flagged the duplicate incident numbers. The review also cited archived notes describing the system upgrade, and it suggested the duplication could stem from a patch mismatch. That explanation did not address why the mile marker differed, and the report listed the discrepancy as unresolved. A county file from 2009 was referenced again because it contained older coordinate tables used before the upgrade. Some investigators believed 2 coordinate tables were mixed, causing teams to search slightly shifted grids on the first afternoon. That possibility appears in state records as a footnote, and it remains uncertain whether it affected the outcome. By early December, the active search scaled down, and periodic checks continued by rangers and volunteers familiar with the terrain. Snow fell in higher elevations, and water levels rose and fell in the wash, changing the scene over time and erasing minor signs. Megan's family organized additional searches, and they kept logs of routes that sometimes overlapped with official maps. Those family logs were later added to the case file, but they were clearly marked as civilian records rather than official entries. Investigators never confirmed any new physical evidence, and no confirmed sightings were verified beyond the first day. The case remained open, and updates were recorded in brief entries without conclusions, keeping language cautious and procedural. In 2011, a hiker reported finding a plastic ID sleeve near a creek bed, and the item was turned over to a ranger station. The sleeve was not Megan's, and the archived notes list it as belonging to another person who had lost it years earlier. In 2019, a separate search training exercise in the region prompted a review of older missing person files. Megan's file was pulled, and the reviewer noted again the same contradictions in timing, location boundaries, and item discovery order. The reviewer wrote that the missing call recording limited verification, and the note referenced retention policies that had since changed. Nothing new was discovered in that review, and the entry ends with a request to keep tips routed through the same incident number. To this day, the official timeline begins with a short call and two competing records, then breaks into parallel versions of events. Luke's account remains the last direct link to Megan's movements, yet even his statements shift in small ways across transcripts. Some locals claimed a vehicle was involved, while others insisted accidents happened there often enough without outside interference. Investigators never confirmed either view, and the evidence that might have settled it was lost, incomplete, or logged too late. In the file, the final page is a standard form, stating the case is unsolved and active, with no confirmed explanation attached.